Let's talk about a second important topic in our discussion, which is called limited thinking. Let's take an example of a person who walks up to a drugstore counter and asks for a particular brand of dental floss. The clerk says it's out of stock. The person concludes that the clerk has the dental floss but just wants to get rid of him because she does not like his looks. This logic seems obviously irrational and paranoid. But consider the case of a husband coming home with a cloudy look on his face. His wife immediately concludes that he's angry because she had a fight with him the previous night. She expects to be hurt by some sort of retaliation and quickly responds by becoming peevish and defensive. This logic makes perfect sense to her, and she does not question her conclusion until she learns that her husband had a minor auto accident on the way home. The progression of logic she used goes like this. My husband looks upset, number one. Number two, my husband often gets upset when he comes home when I disappoint him. Number three, therefore he is upset with me for disappointing him. The problem with this logic lies in her assumption that her husband's mood always relates to her and she is the prime cause of his ups and downs. This pattern of limited thinking, called personalization, is the tendency to relate all the objects and events around you to yourself. Personalization limits you and causes pain because you consistently misinterpret what you see and then act on that misinterpretation. We will examine 8 limited thinking patterns and give you a practice in identifying them at the end. Then it will teach you to analyze the automatic thoughts in your thought journal and identify which of the limited thinking patterns you habitually employ in difficult situations. You will learn, hopefully, how to compose balanced alternative self statements that will become more believable than your painful automatic thoughts, and how to start making action plans based on your new balanced thoughts. In order to change patterns of limited thinking, it is helpful to recognize and identify them. So let's start by explaining some of the most common types. The remainder of this discussion is devoted to explaining how to use your thought journal to identify the patterns you tend to use and develop more balanced thoughts to counter them. Identify the 8 patterns. Here are the most important 8 patterns of limited thinking. It helps to study them separately, one at a time. However, in your ongoing stream of consciousness, these patterns often occur in rapid succession, overlapping and blending into each other. Number 1 is filtering. Filtering is characterized by a sort of tunnel vision, looking at only one element of a situation to the exclusion of everything else. A single detail becomes the focus, and the whole event or situation is colored by this detail. For example, a computer draftsman who was uncomfortable with criticism was praised for his quality drawings and asked to get the next job out a little more quickly. He went home depressed, having decided that his employer thought he was dawdling. He filtered out the praise and focused only on the criticism. Each person looks through their own particular tunnel. Depressed people are hypersensitive to loss and blind to gain. For anxious people, the slightest possibility of danger seems like a bomb threat, even though the scene might otherwise be safe and secure. People who experience chronic anger look through a tunnel that highlights evidence of injustice and screens out fairness and equity. Memory can also be very selective. You may remember only certain kinds of events from your entire life history. When you filter your memories, you often pass over positive experiences and dwell on memories that leave you angry, anxious, or depressing. Filtering causes awe in your thoughts by pulling negative events out of context and focusing on them while ignoring your good experiences. Your fears, losses, irritations become exaggerated in importance because they fill your awareness to the exclusion of everything else. Keywords for the filtering pattern are terrible, awful, disgusting, scary, and so on. A key phrase is I cannot do it, I cannot stand it. The second important pattern is a polarized thinking. Polarized thinking is something called black and white thinking. In this limited thinking pattern, no shades of gray are allowed. You insist on either or choices, perceiving everything at the extremes with very little room for a middle ground. People and things are good or bad, wonderful or horrible, delightful or intolerable. Since your interpretations are extreme, your emotional reactions are extreme, fluctuating from despair to elation, to rage, to ecstasy, or to terror. The greatest danger in polarized thinking is its impact on how you judge yourself. You could believe that if you are not perfect or brilliant, then you must be a failure. There is no room for mistakes or being mediocre. For example, a charter bus driver told himself he was a real loser when he took the wrong freeway exit and had to drive 2 miles out of his way. One mistake meant that he was incompetent and worthless to his own mind, to his own self. Similarly, a single mother with 3 children was determined to be strong and in charge. The moment she felt tired or nervous, she began thinking of herself as weak and falling apart. And she often criticized herself in conversations with friends. Third pattern of importance is overgeneralization. In overgeneralization, you make broad conclusions based on a single incident or a single piece of evidence. One dropped stitch leads you to conclude, I will never learn how to knit. You interpret a rejection on the dance floor as nobody would ever want to dance with me. This pattern can lead to an increasingly restricted life. If you got sick on a train once, you decide never to take a train again. If you got dizzy on a 6th floor balcony, you never go out on balconies again. If you felt anxious the last time you were alone at home, you'll be a wreck every time you're home alone. One bad experience means that whenever you are in a similar situation, you will repeat the bad experience again. Overgeneralizations are often couched in the form of absolute statements, as if there were some immutable law that governs and limits your chances for happiness. Some of the keywords that indicate you may be generalizing are all, every, none, never, always, everybody, and nobody. For example, you are overgeneralizing when you make sweeping conclusions, such as the following. Nobody loves me. I'll never be able to trust anyone again. I will always be sad. I have always had lousy jobs. No one would stay friends with me if they really knew me. Another hallmark of overgeneralization is applying global labels to people, places, and things you don't like. Somebody who refused to give you a ride home is labeled as a total jerk. A quiet guy in your class is a dull, calm person. New York City is a hell on earth. Television is an evil, corrupting influence. You are stupid and totally wasting your life. Each of these labels may contain a grain of truth, but it generalizes that grain into a global judgment that ignores all contrary evidence, making your view of the world stereotyped and one-dimensional. The next important topic is mind reading. When you read mind, you assume you know how others are feeling and what motivates them, which can lead to snap judgments. He's just acting that way because he's jealous. She's only interested in your money. He's afraid to show he cares. If your brother, who recently had a problem in a relationship, visits a new friend 3 times in 1 week, there are any number of conclusions you might arrive at. For example, that he's angry at his previous friend and it's a rebound phenomena, or he's afraid of being alone. Without asking, you have no way of knowing which is true. Mind reading makes one conclusion seem so obviously correct that you assume it is true, act on it inappropriately, and get into trouble. With mind reading, you also make assumptions about how other people are reacting to you. You might assume what your friend is thinking to say to yourself. This close, he sees how difficult a person I am. He doesn't want to be my friend. If he is mind reading too, he may be saying to himself, oh my God, he thinks that I am so immature. You may have a casual encounter with a supervisor at work and come away thinking, oh, she's going to fire me. These assumptions are born of intuition, hunches, vague misgivings, or a couple of past experiences. They are untested and unproven, but you believe them nevertheless. Mind reading arises from a process called projection. You imagine that people feel the same way you do and react to things the same way you do. Therefore, you don't watch or listen closely enough to notice that others are actually different. If you get angry when someone is late, you imagine everyone feels that way. If you feel excruciatingly sensitive to rejection, you expect that most people are the same. If you're very judgmental about particular habits and traits, you assume others share your beliefs. Another important factor is catastrophizing. If you catastrophize, a small leak in the sail boat means it will surely sink. A contractor whose estimate gets underbid concludes that he will never get another job. A headache suggests that brain cancer is looming. Catastrophic thoughts often start with the word what if. You read a newspaper article describing a tragedy or hear gossip about some disaster befalling on a friend or acquaintance, and you start wondering, what if it happens to me? What if I break my leg during skiing? What if they hijack my plane? What if I get sick and have to go on disability? What if my son starts taking drugs? The list is endless. There are no limits to an active, catastrophic imagination. Let's discuss magnifying thoughts now. When you magnify, you emphasize things out of proportion to their actual importance. Small mistakes become tragic failures. Minor suggestions become scathing criticism. A slight backache becomes a ruptured disc. Minor setbacks are cause for despair. Slight obstacles seem like overwhelming barriers. Words like huge, impossible, and overwhelming are magnifying terms. This pattern creates a tone of doom and hysterical pessimism. The flip side of magnifying is minimizing. When you magnify, you view everything negative and difficult in your life through a telescope that enlarges your problems. But when you view your assets, such as your ability to cope and find solutions, you look through the wrong end of the telescope. So everything is positive is minimized for you. Every positive attribute you have seems small to you. Now, a few words about personalization. There are two kinds of personalizations. One involves directly comparing yourself with other people. He plays piano so much better than I can ever do. I'm not smart enough to go with this crowd. He knows himself a lot better than I do. He feels things so deeply while I'm dead inside. Oh, I'm the slowest person in my class. Sometimes the comparison is actually favorable to you. Like he's dumb and I'm smart. I'm better looking than he is. The opportunities for comparison never end. And even when the comparison is favorable, the underlying assumption is that your worth is questionable. Consequently, you must continue to test your value, constantly measuring yourself against others. If you come out better, you have a moment's relief. If you come out short, you feel diminished. Let's start with an example of the other kind of personalization, the tendency to relate everything around you to yourself. A depressed parent blames themselves when they see any sadness in the children. A business person thinks that every time a partner complains of being tired, it means that she is tired of being in business with him. A man whose spouse complains of rising prices hears the complaints as a tax on his ability to provide for the family. There are some factors which we can call shoulds. You may operate from a list of inflexible rules about how you and other people should act, and view these rules as right and indisputable. You see any deviation from your values or standards as bad, and as a result, you often judge others and find faults. People irritate you. They don't act correctly and they don't think correctly. They have unacceptable traits, habits, and opinions that make them hard to tolerate. They should know the rules and they should follow them. One woman felt that her husband should want to take her on Sunday drives. She decided that a man who loves his wife ought to take her to the country and then out to eat in a nice place. The fact that he did not want to meant he only thought about himself. Cue words indicating the presence of this pattern are should, ought, and must. In fact, many therapists think this is a very, very important factor which affects your interpersonal relations. Your shoulds are just as hard on you as they are on other people. You feel compelled to be or act a certain way, but you never ask objectively if it really makes sense. One of the psychiatrists called this the tyranny of shrouds. Here is a list of some of the most common and unreasonable shoulds. It starts always with I should be the epitome of generosity, consideration, dignity, courage, and unselfishness. Be the perfect friend, parent, teacher, student, or spouse. I should be able to endure any hardship with equanimity. I should be able to find a quick solution to every problem. I should never feel hurt. I should always be happy and serene. I should know, understand, and foresee everything. I should never feel certain emotions such as anger or jealousy. I should never make mistakes. I should be totally self-reliant. I should assert myself but never hurt anybody else. I should never be tired or get sick. I should always be at the peak efficiency. Of course, all these things are impossible to achieve by one person. Let's talk about balanced alternatives. There are alternative responses to these 8 patterns of limited thinking. You can use this list as a reference when you're having problems with a particular pattern. Like filtering. You have been stuck in a mental groove focusing on things from your environment that typically frighten, sadden, or anger you. In order to conquer filtering, you will have to deliberately shift focus. You can shift focus in 2 ways. One approach is to place your attention on coping strategies for dealing with the problems rather than obsessing about the problem itself. The other is to focus on the opposite of your primary mental theme. For example, if you tend to focus on the theme of loss, instead focus on what you still have that is of value. If your theme is danger, focus instead on things in your environment that represent comfort and safety. If your theme is injustice, stupidity, or incompetence, shift your focus to what people do that does meet with your approval. Polarized thinking. The key to overcoming polarized thinking is to stop making black or white judgments. People are not either happy or sad, loving or rejecting, brave or cowardly, smart or stupid. They fall somewhere along a continuum between these extremes. Human beings are just too complex to be reduced to either any of these judgments. If you have to make these kinds of rating, think in terms of percentages. About 30% of me is scared to death and 70% is holding on and coping. About 60% of the time he seems terribly preoccupied with himself, but 40% of the time he can be really generous. About 5% of the time I am not feeling well, but the rest of the time I do well all right. Overgeneralization. Overgeneralization is exaggeration, the tendency to take a button and sew a vest on it. Fight it by quantifying instead of using words like huge, awful, massive, minuscule, and so on and so forth. For example, if you catch yourself thinking, "We're buried under massive debt," rephrase with the quantity, "We owe $47,000. Another way to avoid overgeneralization is to examine how much evidence you really have for your conclusion. If the conclusion is based on 1 or 2 cases, a single mistake, or one small symptom, Throw it out until you have more convincing proof. This is such a powerful technique that most of the next chapter is devoted to amassing evidence for and against your hot thoughts. Stop thinking in absolutes by avoiding words such as every, all, always, none, never, everybody, and nobody. Statements that include these words ignore the exceptions and shades of grey. Replace absolutes with words such as may, sometimes, and often. Be particularly sensitive to absolute predictions about the future, such as no one will ever care about me. They are extremely dangerous because as you behave in accordance with them, they can become self fulfilling prophecies. Pay close attention to the words you use to describe yourself and others. Replace frequently used negative labels with more neutral terms. For example, if you call your habitual caution cowardice, replace it with care. Think of your excitable mother as a vicious instead of ditzy. Instead of blaming yourself being lazy, call yourself laid back. Now, how to deal with mind reading. In the long run, you're probably better off making no inferences about people at all. Either believe what they tell you or hold no belief about their thoughts and motivations until conclusive evidence comes your way. Treat all your notions and ideas about people as hypotheses to be tested and checked out by asking them. Sometimes you cannot check out your interpretations. For instance, you may not be ready to ask your friend whether he is withdrawing from his family because he's angry or he wants to leave the family, but you can decrease your anxiety by generalizing alternative, by interpreting the alternative reactions and behaviors. Perhaps your friend is studying hard, perhaps depressed because he's deeply engrossed in a project or worrying about his future. By generating a string of possibilities, you may find a more neutral interpretation that's as likely to be true as your deepest suspicions. This process also underlines the fact that you really cannot know accurately what others are thinking and feeling unless they tell you. Now, dealing with catastrophic thoughts. Catastrophic thoughts are called the royal road to anxiety. As soon as you catch yourself thinking of catastrophic thoughts, ask yourself, what are the odds? Make an honest assessment of the situation in terms of odds or percentage of availability or probability. Are the chances of disaster 1 in 100,000, 0.001%, 1 in 1,000, 0.1%, or 1 in 20, 5%? Looking at the odds help you realistically reevaluate what is frightening you. Dealing with magnifying thoughts. To combat magnifying, stop using words like terrible, awful, disgusting, horrendous, and so on. In particular, stop using phrases like, I cannot stand it, it is impossible, and it is unbearable. You can stand it because history shows that human beings can survive almost any psychological blow and can endure incredible physical pain. You can get used to and cope with almost anything. Try saying phrases such as, I can cope, and I can survive, and I can do it, to yourself. Not to others, to yourself. Dealing with personalization. If you assume that the reactions of others are often about you, force yourself to check it out. Maybe the reason your boss is frowning isn't that you're late. Make no conclusions unless you are satisfied that you have reasonable evidence and proof. When you catch yourself comparing yourself to others, remind yourself that everyone has strong and weak points. By matching your weak points to the corresponding strong points of others, you're just looking for ways to demoralize yourself. The fact is, human beings are too complex for casual comparisons to have any meanings. It would take you months to catalog and compare all the thousands of traits and abilities of two people you might have met in the last 2 years. How to deal with shoulds. Re-examine and question any personal rules or expectations that include the words should, ought, or must. Flexible rules and expectations don't use these words because there are always exceptions and special circumstances. Think of at least three exceptions to your rule, and then imagine all the exceptions there must be that you cannot think of. You may get irritated when people don't act according to your value, but your personal values are just that personal. They're nothing more than personal. They may work for you, but as missionaries have discovered all over the world, they don't always work for others. People, after all, are not all the same. The key is to focus on each person's uniqueness, his or her particular needs, limitations, fears, and players. Because it is impossible to know all of these complex interrelations, even with intimate people, you cannot be certain whether your values apply to another. You are entitled to an opinion, but allow for a possibility that you may be wrong. Also, allow other people to find different things important. Combat patterns. Now that we have learned to identify limited thinking patterns and we are aware of alternative thoughts, it is time to apply our new skills to the thought journal that we started earlier. I recommend that you draw a 3-column chart in your journal. Start by analyzing your most distressing automatic thoughts to see which limited thinking pattern is most characteristic of each. Write them in the first column. You may find evidence of more than one limited thinking patterns. Write down all that apply. In the next column, rewrite your automatic thoughts in a more balanced way or compose an alternative thought that refutes the automatic thought. In the last column, rate your feelings against after you have worked on countering your automatic thoughts using the same scale of 0 to 100, in which 0 means the feeling causes no distress and 100 is the most distressing emotion you have ever felt. The feeling should be less intense as a result of your work. Action plans would be that your balanced or alternative thoughts may suggest actions you can take, such as checking out assumptions, gathering information, make an assertive request, clearing up misunderstandings, making plans, changing your schedule, resolving unfinished business, and so on and so forth. Circle any action item in your second column and plan when you will put them into action. It may feel difficult, time-consuming, or embarrassing to follow your action plan. You may have to break your plan down into a series of easier steps and schedule each step separately, but it's worth doing. Behavior that is inspired by your balanced and alternative thoughts will greatly reduce the frequency and power of your negative automatic thoughts. Using your thought journal to identify balanced alternatives and create action plans is essential. It is the basic skill you need to master in order to use cognitive therapy to reduce painful feelings like anxiety and depression. Most people make progress during the first week of faithfully keeping a thought journal. The longer you participate, tuning into your automatic thoughts, the better you will get at it. It's a skill like knitting, skiing, writing, or singing, and keep practice is what makes you perfect.